I watched her cross the street with hurried steps, as if the whole world could see what she was about to do. The outfit she wore wasn't for any ordinary dinner. It was the kind of dress you choose to be noticed, to provoke something in someone, not for a business meeting. She'd told me she had a company dinner, a formal event, something too important to miss. I simply nodded, but something burned inside me, a silent unease that wouldn't let me breathe. It wasn't irrational jealousy, it wasn't paranoia. It was the instinct of someone who knows every detail of a look, of someone who's read that expression on a face and knows when something isn't right. The moment I saw the note with the address, hidden in the drawer, I felt as if all the air had been knocked out of me. An address, a time, and nothing more. No explanation. Just silence and the lie camouflaged in the practiced smile she gave me before leaving. I followed her that night, keeping my distance, as if each step were calculated torture. The city lights flickered indifferently, cars passed, lives continued, but mine seemed about to shatter. When I stopped in front of the restaurant, a small, elegant, and intimate place, my heart already knew what my eyes hadn't yet confirmed. Through the window, I saw the scene that would burn me forever, her, sitting across from a man I'd never seen, smiling in a way she hadn't smiled at me in a long time. Her gaze shone in a way that hurt, as if there, with this stranger, she'd found a piece of happiness she'd said no longer existed between us. I walked in. Not to create a scene, but to look her in the eye and ask, wordlessly, why? She froze the moment she saw me. The glass in her hand stopped in midair. Her face drained of color. And before I could say anything, she tried to compose a nervous, almost childish smile, saying, as if that would defuse the scene, "Honey, it's not at all what you think, this one's just a friend from work." Those words sounded like iron scraping glass. Not because of the lie itself, but because of the cowardice of still trying to protect myself from the truth I already carried in my chest. I took a deep breath and replied, without raising my voice, but with the weight of someone breaking something inside. "I know everything. You don't need to deceive me. I hope you're right about the choice you're making, because I'm leaving your life. I'm taking our children with me." I saw her eyes fill with panic, as if until that moment she hadn't imagined the consequences could be so devastating. It wasn't just about losing me. It was about losing family, the children's embrace in the morning, the smell of coffee in the kitchen, the home we'd built over years of shared life. I left before any tears of mine could fall in front of her. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the face that, for so long, had been my safe haven, now transforming into the image of a stranger I no longer knew. The following days were silent. The sound of the house without her seemed louder than any scream. The children asked, at first, where their mother was. I answered with half-truths, because I didn't know how to explain that sometimes the ones we love most are also the ones who hurt us the most. Over time, they stopped asking. And that's when I realized, they were learning to live without her. Time passed, but it didn't heal everything. Scars don't disappear, they just settle inside us. I began to rebuild myself. Step by step, pain turned to caution, and caution turned to strength. I learned to wake up without waiting for a "good morning" from her, to sleep without wondering if she was coming home late. And, in this silent process, I met someone. Not in the overwhelming way seen in the movies, but in the rarest way, calmly, patiently, respectfully. She arrived as if she didn't want to take up space, but little by little, she filled all the voids. I wasn't looking for her, but I found her. Meanwhile, she continued to stumble over her own regrets. She tried to reconnect, first with cold messages, then with calls filled with a longing she couldn't handle when she felt it. I didn't respond. Not out of pride, but because I knew any response could drag me back to a place I'd fought to escape. Until one day, at the park where we used to take the kids, our paths crossed. She saw me pushing our son's swing, while the woman now walking beside me held our daughter in her arms, laughing happily, as if she'd always been a part of our history. She stopped, motionless, watching from afar, and I saw in her eyes the exact moment it hit her, the family she destroyed was there again, only without her. She approached. Her gaze held a mixture of fear, shame, and urgency. She asked to talk. The children ran to play farther away, and my companion, with a simple gesture, stepped aside to give us space. We stood face to face. She said she was sorry, that she didn't know how she could have traded all that for a moment of illusion. Her voice trembled. I don't want to justify anything. I just wanted to ask for forgiveness. I listened. And, for the first time since that night at the restaurant, I realized I no longer felt anger. Only a deep weariness, like someone who's been carrying a weight for a long time and can finally let go. I forgive you, she said. And I saw tears stream down her face. But before she could smile hopefully, I added, but I can't go back. I love someone else now. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. She understood. There was no more room for us. What we had was over, not because the love never existed, but because she killed it the day she chose another path. She turned and walked away, carrying on her shoulders the weight of a loss no other relationship could replace. And I stood there, watching the children run back to me, feeling that, for the first time, the final chapter of that story had been written. But what happened between that night at the restaurant and the day I met her again in the park, is something neither she, nor I, nor anyone else could have predicted. A sequence of choices, encounters, and revealed truths that would forever change the way we both understood love, loyalty, and the price of a wrong decision. Welcome to the channel. Here, no betrayal is romanticized or condoned. All the stories you hear are fictional, but they carry a harsh truth. Betrayal destroys lives, corrodes families, and leaves scars that never fade. Our goal is to show the true price of a wrong choice. Brace yourself, because now you're about to hear an intense, emotional, and shocking story. Dawn arrived with a soft glow through the windows of Michael and Emily's house, a home that seemed shaped by the patience of years of living together. They lived on a quiet street, where neighbors knew the sound of their two children, Noah and Sophie, laughing and playing in the yard. The kitchen always smelled of fresh coffee in the morning, while Emily set the table with the care that transformed simple gestures into small rituals of love. Michael, for his part, had a habit of getting up before everyone else to enjoy a few minutes of silence, sitting on the porch, watching the street slowly come to life. They were a couple who, to any outsider's eyes, carried an image of stability and complicity, as if life had adjusted to their rhythm, shaping a comfortable and predictable routine. Michael worked in a downtown office, a place that didn't require glamour, but did demand organization and commitment. He was dedicated, meticulous, and took pride in keeping his family financially secure. Emily, an elementary school teacher, had a way of connecting with children that enchanted everyone. She was the kind of person who could calm an entire class with just the tone of her voice and who would come home with funny stories about her students. Responsibilities were divided evenly, and weekends were reserved for family activities, outings in the park, simple dinners with friends, and movie nights on the couch. There was a seemingly solid connection between them, made up of glances and small gestures. Michael noticed when Emily was tired and, without needing to be asked, took on household chores to lighten her load. Emily, in turn, sensed Michael's stress after long hours of work and always found a way to comfort him, whether by preparing his favorite meal or simply sitting beside him in silence. They had a history of overcoming hardships together, times when finances were tight, family illnesses, and even relocations that required courage and adaptation. All of these experiences reinforced the idea that, even on the worst days, they had each other to lean on. The home they shared was a reflection of this life they had built together. It wasn't luxurious, but it was full of personality in every corner. Photographs of their children since birth filled the hallway walls, daily reminders of the journey they had made. In the backyard, a swing Michael had made swayed in the wind, even when the children weren't around. At night, the living room was lit with a warm yellow light that made everything feel more welcoming, creating a sense of security that seemed unshakable. Close friends said they had the perfect life, and although Michael and Emily knew perfection didn't exist, they took pride in being together and managing to maintain harmony despite external pressures. However, life rarely stands still. Small changes emerge, almost imperceptible, like a breeze before a storm. Michael began to notice that Emily's schedule was busier, that her commitments extended beyond the usual meetings with colleagues or school meetings. She talked about new projects, about after-hours events, but always with the naturalness of someone hiding nothing. He, who had always trusted her, accepted explanations without question, believing that mutual respect was the strongest foundation they had. Emily, on the other hand, seemed to carry a different energy, sometimes more animated, sometimes more distant, as if there were thoughts she didn't want or couldn't share. Their relationship didn't abruptly lose its affection. Mornings still featured hurried kisses, and late afternoons still brought conversations about the day. But there were new nuances in their tone, longer pauses before answering questions, and silences that had once been comfortable began to feel charged with something Michael couldn't name. He tried to fill these gaps with more attention to his children, taking Noah to soccer practice and helping Sophie with drawings and schoolwork. Emily watched it all with a smile that seemed sincere but carried a shadow of worry underneath, as if she were struggling with something she didn't want anyone to see. The children were the center of everything. Noah, at 9, had inherited his father's sense of responsibility, caring for his sister as if he were much older. Sophie, at 6, was pure curiosity and energy, spreading drawings and laughter throughout the house. Michael and Emily were always careful not to let outside problems interfere with the family environment. Evenings were sacred for bedtime stories, and Sundays were untouchable for being together. This dedication to family was what kept them together, or at least that's what Michael believed. The couple's closest friends, when they visited, noticed something was different, but didn't comment. The sensation was subtle, almost like a change in the weather from one season to another, only truly noticeable when summer has turned to fall. Michael, in his practical nature, believed that the small distances would resolve themselves, as they always had. Emily, for her part, seemed to be torn between the life she had and thoughts that took her far away, even though her body was there. She didn't stop participating in activities with her children, she didn't stop talking to Michael, but there was a different sparkle in her eyes, a sparkle that, to him, was still a mystery. In the neighborhood, everyone knew the family for their involvement in community events. Emily organized fundraisers for the school, and Michael volunteered to repair neighboring houses. This public life helped maintain an image of unity and commitment, but it also created a silent pressure to keep everything running smoothly, even when something seemed out of whack inside. Time continued to march on, taking with it seemingly ordinary days, yet filled with small changes. Michael, unbeknownst to himself, was about to realize that the greatest transformations come not with grandiose announcements, but with almost invisible details that only reveal themselves when it's too late. It was hard to imagine that a couple with so much history together, who had overcome so many obstacles, could be shaken by something unexpected. But life, in its unpredictable way, was about to test the limits of both their trust and emotional resilience. Emily seemed to be approaching a point where decisions would need to be made, while Michael, still clinging to the idea that the love they had built was unbreakable, couldn't imagine that some choices have the power to change everything forever, even if they are made in silence. The stage was set, the characters formed, and the invisible thread that bound the family began to strain imperceptibly, waiting for a moment when it could no longer resist. The days seemed to follow the same predictable rhythm as always, but there was something in the air that was different. Michael noticed, almost unconsciously, that Emily was more distant. It wasn't an explicit distance, like arguments or angry silences. It was a subtle absence, a lost look in the middle of a conversation, a longer delay in answering a simple question, a smile that faded all too quickly. She had started going out more often, justifying school commitments, meetings with colleagues, events for which she hadn't asked him to accompany her. Until then, Michael had never had reason to doubt his wife, but now there was a nagging feeling that was beginning to grow, like a small pebble in one's shoe that, at first, seems bearable, but over time becomes impossible to ignore. The nights, once filled with conversations and small routines between the two of them, began to change. Emily would arrive later, claiming tiredness, and disappear to take a shower before even greeting him properly. He noticed her perfume was different, not the one she usually wore every day, but a more striking scent, reserved for special occasions. Her gestures remained gentle, but there was a mismatch in her touch, a lack of commitment in her embrace. Michael tried to convince himself he was just imagining things, that it was a time of more work and responsibilities, but the discomfort wouldn't leave him alone. The children began to comment on their mother's less presence in the late afternoons. Sophie said she wanted more bedtime stories, and Noah asked when they would go on the park trip Emily had promised. Michael accepted these absences without question, but deep down, he began to wonder if those absences were inevitable or if they had become a choice. Still, he maintained the trust that had always been the foundation between them, trying to believe that everything would return to normal. It was on a rainy afternoon that he encountered something that profoundly shook his certainties. Searching for a document in a drawer in his home office, he found a small, carefully folded piece of paper. The address written on it meant nothing to him at first glance, but next to it was a time written. No signature, no explanation. The detail that made his chest tighten was that the paper was in Emily's handwriting, a handwriting he knew as well as his own face. He tucked the note into his pocket, without commenting at the time. I didn't know if it was better to ask directly or wait to understand what it really meant. That night passed slowly. Emily seemed normal, chatted about trivial matters, laughed at the children, and acted as if nothing was out of place. Michael, on the other hand, observed every gesture, every pause, every change in tone. When she mentioned that the next day there would be a school dinner to discuss a special project, he merely nodded, but deep down, he sensed that the note and the appointment were no coincidence. He slept little, his mind racing with possibilities he couldn't believe. The next day, he decided not to go straight home after work. He waited for Emily to emerge, elegantly dressed, with a sparkle in her eyes he hadn't seen in a while. He followed her in the car, keeping his distance, his heart beating faster at every turn. The illuminated streets reflected off the wet bodywork, and he tried not to think about what he might find. The address led him to a discreet restaurant, the kind you don't see in advertisements but which has its own charm and a private atmosphere. Michael parked across the street and watched. The glass door opened, and he saw Emily greeted by a man he didn't know. Tall, with a confident posture, and an intimate smile that needed no words to be understood. They entered together, and he walked her to the table, lightly touching her back, a gesture simple but charged with familiarity. Michael remained in the car for a few minutes, trying to decide what to do. Every second felt like a blow, and his heavy breathing made it difficult to think. Finally, he got out and crossed the street, unhurriedly, but with the certainty that he needed to look her in the eye. The restaurant was lit by soft lights, and the sound of low conversations mingled with the aroma of elaborate dishes. He found her sitting across from him, smiling in a way she hadn't smiled at him in a long time. Her hand rested on the table, close to his, almost touching. Emily was slow to notice Michael's presence. When she saw him, shock filled her expression. The smile faded, and she stood still for a moment, as if time had stopped. The man looked back, confused, and Michael remained there, not sitting, not making a scene, just staring at her with silent determination. She tried to speak, but her voice was shaky. Her first excuse came quickly, as if rehearsed. She said he was a friend from work, that there was nothing wrong with the situation. The words fell heavily, unconvincing. Michael didn't respond immediately. He observed every detail, the way she clasped her hands, the blush on her face, the averted gaze. He didn't need anything else to understand what was happening. The nearby table seemed oblivious, but for Michael, the world was concentrated in that moment. He took a deep breath, controlling his anger and the urge to make a scene out of this. He spoke softly, with the firmness of someone making a final decision. He said he knew what was happening, that he no longer needed excuses, and that he was leaving her life. And, with a tone that made it clear there was no room for negotiation, he stated he would take the children with him. Emily was speechless. Panic filled her eyes, but there was nothing she could say to stop him from walking away. He left the restaurant feeling a huge weight on his shoulders, but also a strange clarity. He didn't look back. Each step out of that place felt like closing a chapter, even though he didn't know exactly what would come next. The light rain dampened his shirt, but he didn't care. When he reached his car, he took a deep breath and remained silent, letting reality settle in. Inside, behind the glass doors, Emily remained seated, paralyzed, staring blankly. And, unbeknownst to him, what lay behind that betrayal was much more than he could have imagined, something that was yet to surface and that would forever change the way he would view not only her, but also everything they had experienced together. The meeting took place weeks later, when the weight of the decisions had already changed the course of everyone's lives. Michael was at the park with Noah and Sophie, enjoying a sunny afternoon. The children ran and laughed, while he watched from a distance, with the calm of someone beginning to find new balance. Beside him, the woman who had recently entered his life, Laura, held Sophie in her arms and spoke to her affectionately, as if she were already part of the family. It was at that moment that Emily appeared, standing a few feet away, watching the scene with an expression that mixed longing, regret, and a hint of fear. Her gaze roamed every gesture, every smile, and it was as if she were seeing something that had once belonged to her but was now definitively out of reach. Emily approached slowly, as if unsure if she was welcome. Michael noticed and, with a gesture, asked the children to move to a farther place to play. Laura, understanding something delicate was happening, naturally moved away, keeping her distance. The silence that formed between them wasn't hostile, but it carried the weight of everything that had been left unanswered. Emily took a deep breath before speaking, and her voice was low, almost a whisper. She said she needed to apologize, that she knew words wouldn't erase anything, but that she needed to at least say how sorry she was. Michael listened without interrupting, his gaze steady, but without the anger she feared she would encounter. When she finished, he replied that he forgave her and that he no longer held hatred in his heart, but that life had moved on, and he now loved someone else. Emily lowered her eyes, and for a few seconds the sound of children playing was the only thing filling the space between them. Then, in a hesitant voice, she told him there was something he needed to know, something she'd never told him for fear of destroying everything even more irreversibly. Michael frowned, unsure of the need for further revelations, since everything, it seemed, was resolved. But her tone, filled with urgency and sadness, made him pay attention. She explained that the night he saw her at the restaurant, that man wasn't just a stranger with whom she'd become emotionally involved. He was someone who had been a secret part of her life for months, and not just out of attraction or fling. Emily revealed that, in a moment of weakness, she had approached him seeking something she felt she'd lost in her marriage, attention, novelty, a sense of being desired again. But, to her surprise, that involvement had begun completely calculatedly on his part. He knew who Michael was, knew details of their lives, and approached her with a purpose that had nothing to do with love. Michael felt his body freeze as she spoke. Emily continued, explaining that she discovered too late that the man had been a childhood friend of someone who harbored a long-standing grudge against Michael, something he himself might not even remember. The dinner, the conversations, the secret meetings, it had all been a trap to hurt him, to attack what was most precious to him. When she finally realized this, she was already too involved to back out without everything coming to light. She tried to cut off contact, but he threatened to expose photos and messages, leaving her trapped in a situation that became untenable. And that was why, even that night, she couldn't tell the truth, because it wasn't just a betrayal of his love, it was also a personal humiliation she was afraid to admit. Michael kept his gaze fixed on her, feeling a mixture of disgust and disbelief rise in his chest. He asked why, even after everything, she never came to tell him, and Emily replied that, deep down, she was ashamed to admit that she had allowed someone to infiltrate their lives like that. She said she was afraid of being seen not only as unfaithful, but as naive and weak. Michael took a deep breath, absorbing every word. His initial anger gave way to a more complex feeling. There was no justification for the betrayal, but now he saw that the hole was deeper than he had imagined. Emily tried to get closer, lightly touching his arm, and asked, almost begging, for him to believe that, despite everything, the love she felt for him never left her. She said she had let herself be carried away by a moment of vulnerability, that she had regretted it from the first moment, and that nothing she had experienced with that man had equaled what she had lost. Michael took a step back, not aggressively, but with the clarity of someone who knows there is no going back. He said he understood, that he believed in her regret, but that it didn't change the fact that her choices had ended any possibility of resuming their life together. Tears streamed down Emily's face, and she seemed ready to break down. She looked at the children playing in the distance and said she knew she could never make up for lost time, but she hoped she could at least rebuild some kind of healthy relationship for their sake. Michael nodded, saying he would never impede her relationship with her children, but that, as for them both, the chapter was definitely closed. Emily understood. There were no more arguments, no attempts at persuasion. Just a resigned silence that said more than any words. As she walked away, Michael watched for a moment, feeling the weight of everything he had learned. The revelation didn't erase the pain of betrayal, but it explained the depth of the rupture. Still, he knew he couldn't let it consume him. When Noah and Sophie rushed back to him, Laura approached with a serene smile. And in that moment, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be, leaving the past behind, even if its scars would remain forever. Michael sat on the park bench for a few minutes after Emily walked away, watching her figure disappear into the trees. The air felt suddenly colder, even with the sun still high, and he realized that, despite having heard the truth, there was a hard-to-define emptiness. It wasn't anger anymore, nor pure sadness. It was a feeling of being faced with a closed chapter that, painful as it had been, now had no room for new pages. The children returned to him, laughing and holding balloons a vendor had given them. Laura approached and placed her hand on his shoulder, not asking anything, simply offering that silent presence that, in recent months, had become a safe haven. He smiled at her, a small but sincere smile, and got up to leave, feeling that the day needed to end far from any shadows of the past. In the following days, Emily tried to maintain contact, albeit discreetly. She sent messages asking about the children and if she could see them on the weekend, and Michael responded directly, not allowing any conversations that strayed from the topic of his children. He had decided not to allow the recent revelation to destabilize the new life he was building. Laura, for her part, kept the subject to a minimum, respecting the space he needed to process everything. There was, however, a silent understanding between them. Emily would remain a part of the children's lives, but she would no longer have any power over Michael's choices. One afternoon, Emily called to pick up Noah and Sophie from school for a field trip. Michael agreed, but preferred to go along to drop off the children himself. When he arrived, he found Emily waiting outside and noticed she looked more haggard than before. Her face was pale and her eyes puffy, as if she'd been crying for hours. He didn't ask why, but he could tell she wanted to talk. As the children got into her car, she leaned closer and said, in a low voice, that the man she'd been involved with was trying to get in touch again. Michael just took a deep breath, showing no surprise. Emily explained that he wanted to make things right, but that she didn't want to and that she was afraid of his reactions. Michael listened silently, then replied that her life was now her own responsibility, that he had no intention of getting involved, but that, for the sake of the children, he hoped she knew how to protect herself. This conversation left an uncomfortable residue in Michael. It wasn't out of love or a desire to save her, but rather an understanding that, in some way, she had entered into a dangerous game with someone who should never have been a part of their lives. In the following days, he focused more on his children and Laura. They began making plans together, a short trip to the coast, new weekend outings, small renovations to the house that now bore her presence. Laura increasingly became part of that routine, interacting with the children with patience and care, building a solid bond that needed no rush. A few weeks later, Michael and Laura attended a community event in the neighborhood, a simple affair that brought together many familiar families. While chatting with neighbors, he noticed Emily approaching, holding the children by the hand. Their eyes met, and there was a mix of awkwardness and acceptance. The children ran off to play together, and Emily approached, this time without tension. She asked if they could talk briefly, and Laura, sensing the moment, stepped aside to greet others. Emily began by saying she was trying to reorganize her life, that she had completely cut off contact with the man and was focused solely on work and her children. Michael listened but didn't ask any questions. He simply said he hoped she could move on, because, even though the past still left its mark, it was impossible to live looking back. At that moment, Emily paused and took a deep breath, as if she wanted to say something more but decided against it at the last second. She changed the subject to the children, and the conversation ended without tension. However, Michael was left with the feeling that there was still something she was holding back, something that might never be said, and it no longer bothered him as it once had. He knew that not all truths need to be exposed in order to move forward. As the months passed, life began to adjust. Laura and Michael grew closer and closer, creating moments that had the simplicity of real things. There was no rush, but there was consistency, and that, for him, was more valuable than any overwhelming passion. Emily, on the other hand, remained present in her children's lives, but with clear boundaries. She seemed to understand that the place she once held by Michael's side now belonged to someone else, and that there was nothing that could change that. Their interactions became civil, without rancor, but also without intimacy. One day, while picking up Noah and Sophie from school, Michael noticed that Laura had prepared a special snack for everyone to eat on the way home. The children laughed and shared stories from school, and as he drove, he realized that this was the kind of peace he'd always wanted, not the absence of problems, but the knowledge that the people around him were there because they wanted to be, not because they had to be. Emily's betrayal had left wounds, but it had also opened space for something new and healthier. It was strange to think that without that brokenness, he might never have found this new path. The last time Emily tried to say something more personal was on a normal day, dropping the kids off at his house. She stood for a moment at the door, watching Laura set the table for dinner. With a sad smile, she said she was glad to see he was okay and that the kids were surrounded by care. Michael thanked her, and she added that, as difficult as it had been to accept, she knew he deserved to be with someone who was their body and soul. He simply replied that everyone deserves that, and said goodbye. As he closed the door, he realized he no longer felt the weight of the old story. What he had now was a mature understanding that some relationships end not because they were never valuable, but because, at some point, someone decided to gamble on something that didn't stand the test of time. He wouldn't forget what happened, but he also wouldn't let it define who he was or what he could still live for. The new life he was building with Laura, with the children close by, was proof that even after a painful fall, it's possible to rise again and find something genuine. And this time, he wasn't about to let it slip away. Life seemed to have found a new rhythm after the storm, but like any calming sea, waves still arrived from time to time to remind us that peace is never absolute. Michael remained firm in his decision to keep his relationship with Emily limited to what was necessary for the children's well-being. He didn't seek closeness, but neither did he create unnecessary barriers. Their meetings took place in practical situations, almost always briefly, and each went their separate ways soon after. However, something new was beginning to emerge, not a rapprochement, but a silent dilemma, something that, for Michael, touched a deep part of his consciousness. He began to notice that Noah and Sophie, despite adapting to their new routine, still carried a weight in their eyes that hadn't existed before. They seemed happy with Laura and laughed with her spontaneously, but there were moments of silence when their mother was mentioned, as if there was a delicate emotional territory they didn't know how to navigate. Michael understood that he couldn't fill Emily's place in their lives, just as she would never occupy the space Laura was carving out, but he wondered to what extent he should encourage them to maintain a closer bond with their mother. This question began to bother him because it went against the personal pain he still carried. He knew he could simply let things unfold naturally, without interfering, but something in him told him the children needed more than superficial interaction. It was an internal battle between protecting his own heart and ensuring his children wouldn't grow up with emotional gaps. Laura sensed this uneasiness and, although she didn't get directly involved, made it clear that she would support any decision that put the children's well-being first. Meanwhile, Emily subtly demonstrated that she was trying to change. She no longer mentioned the past, didn't ask for second chances, and when she was with her children, her focus was completely on them. Michael noticed that she avoided any behavior that might generate distrust, such as arriving late or canceling dates without explanation. Still, there was a huge gap between her efforts and the possibility of fully regaining the lost trust. He had no doubt that they would never be a couple again, but he was beginning to recognize that perhaps there was a new kind of relationship, not romantic, but human, that they would need to build for the sake of the children. This realization was reinforced on a seemingly ordinary day, when Noah had a minor accident at school and needed stitches in his knee. Michael was on his way to work when he got the call, and upon arriving at the hospital, he found Emily already there, sitting beside her son, holding his hand and telling him stories to distract him from the pain. She looked at him as he entered, and there were no words. Just a silent wave that somehow broke down part of the wall he had built. Seeing her care in that moment stirred something within him, not in the sense of rekindling romantic feelings, but in the recognition that, despite everything, there was an unbreakable bond between them, their children. In the days that followed, this memory wouldn't leave Michael's mind. He began to reflect on what forgiveness truly meant. Until then, the forgiveness he offered had been more of a personal liberation than a bridge to any kind of reconnection. Now, he faced a more complex choice: to use this forgiveness as a tool to build a new, cooperative relationship or to keep it merely a milestone that closed the past. It wasn't a simple decision, because any attempt at rapprochement could be misinterpreted by Emily, and he didn't want to send mixed messages. While he pondered this, life with Laura was stable. She was already a part of the children's daily lives, and their relationship was based on respect and communication. However, Michael knew this dilemma could affect their relationship. Laura, always attentive, noticed the conflict and asked him directly if he still had feelings for Emily. His answer was clear: no. What he had now was only concern for Noah and Sophie's emotional future. Laura listened calmly and said she trusted him, but that she would need to understand his limits if this connection were to happen. The moral dilemma intensified when Emily asked Michael to accompany her to a meeting at Noah's school, believing it was important for them to demonstrate unity as parents. He hesitated but agreed, thinking it wasn't about personal bonding, but about demonstrating shared responsibility. On the day of the meeting, they sat side by side and listened to the teachers discuss their son's performance. It was a strangely familiar moment, as if, for a few moments, they had returned to their previous roles, but without the intimacy they had felt. As they left, Emily thanked him sincerely, and Michael realized that this simple gesture had meant more to her than he had imagined. In the days that followed, he began to consider proposing regular get-togethers between them and the children, not as a family in the traditional sense, but as parents capable of sharing important moments. The idea, however, left him conflicted. Part of him wanted to protect Laura from any discomfort, and part wanted to prevent Emily from interpreting this as a chance to win him back. At the same time, he was certain that, for the children, seeing them together on specific occasions could provide a sense of security they still craved. This thought haunted him for weeks, until an unexpected event brought the issue to the forefront even more forcefully. Sophie was chosen to participate in a school performance and, with an anxious look on her face, asked that they both be present to see her. Michael felt the weight of that request. There was no way to say no without deeply disappointing his daughter. So he spoke to Laura, who, to his surprise, said she saw no problem, as long as it was clear that it was in the children's best interest. On the day of the performance, Michael and Emily sat side by side in the audience, with children searching for them in the crowd. When Sophie walked on stage and smiled at the sight of them together, he felt a mixture of pride and relief. For a few minutes, the past no longer mattered, and all that remained was the present, with his daughter radiant and confident that she had their support. At the end of the event, there were no hugs or exchanges of emotionally charged words. Just a respectful greeting and the feeling that, perhaps, that was the key to dealing with what remained, not erasing the past, but finding a way to live with its scars. Michael knew that by allowing these moments, he was walking a fine line. The balance between preserving new life and giving the children what they needed would require constant care. But he also knew that if he wanted to build a solid future for everyone, he would need to face this challenge with maturity. And while there was still a long way to go until the end of this story, he was beginning to understand that sometimes the true outcome isn't in winning or losing, but in learning to live with what fate has thrown your way. The routine found a more stable rhythm after the school presentation, as if home and affection had learned a new language that everyone, little by little, began to understand. Still, there were inevitable intersections, points of contact that required care and choice. Michael began planning a weekend with Laura and the kids at the coast, a short trip to clear everyone's heads, when Noah asked in the back seat of the car if his mother could spend at least one day with them, not in the same place, but on the same trip, because he wanted to show them both the sea at the same time. He wanted his parents to see the goal he promised to make in the sand and for his sister to build a castle with everyone nearby. Michael gripped the steering wheel tightly, and the answer didn't come immediately. Laura sensed the tension and broke the silence with a gentle, unassuming tone, saying they could think of a way to make it special for the kids without confusing things, that perhaps a shared beach day, with clear agreements and set times, would be possible. Michael looked at her askance, grateful but worried about opening doors he'd decided to keep closed. That night, when the children were asleep, he spoke quietly to Laura, admitting he was afraid of turning a gesture for their children into a misleading message for Emily. Laura, with the calm she'd won over him, replied that misleading messages only happen when boundaries aren't clear, that he could handle it with the firmness he'd been demonstrating, and that if it were truly for Noah and Sophie's good, she would be there, not as a supporting character, but as a real part of this new family that was forming. The invitation to Emily was direct, straightforward, and without any room for hope. He wrote that Noah and Sophie wanted a day at the beach with them both nearby, that Laura would be there too, that schedules would be aligned, and that he intended to keep everything focused on the children. Emily took a while to respond, and when she did, she thanked him briefly, saying she would only go if it didn't cause any discomfort to anyone and that she would respect all boundaries. On the appointed day, the sky cleared enough for a bright morning, the wind blew gently, and the sea seemed to call the children by name. Noah ran with his ball at his feet, Sophie dragged her colorful bucket, and Michael, seeing Emily approaching with a towel and sunscreen in her hands, felt something strange. It doesn't hurt anymore, he thought, and the realization brought relief and responsibility. Emily stopped a few steps away and said she was grateful for the chance to see her children like this, without tension, that she was aware of her place and didn't want to disrupt what was growing there. Laura approached, not coldly or with forced intimacy, just respectfully, and said that the important thing was for Noah and Sophie to enjoy themselves, that they could start building the sandcastle foundations together while Michael helped mark the goalposts. Emily nodded, and for the first time in a long time, the four adults did something coordinated without trampling on feelings. There were brief exchanges, but they were full of what truly mattered. When Noah scored a goal, he ran first to his father, then to his mother, and finally hugged Laura as if uniting three places in his heart in one gesture. Emily smiled with moist eyes and said he was playing more freely, and Michael replied that the boy seemed to breathe better when he felt everyone around him was at peace, and Laura added that peace isn't the absence of history, it's the way we carry history without letting it weigh down the children. Emily was silent for a long second and murmured that she wanted to learn this, that she was trying to learn without asking for anything in return. The tide slowly rose, and with it came a dilemma Michael had been putting off. Sophie's birthday was approaching, and the girl had asked for a small party at home, with chocolate cake and music in the backyard. The request came with a shy addition, the kind children make looking at the ground, as if the world could deny it, that her mother could help hang the flags because she always did it straight and without falling. Michael swallowed hard. Inviting Emily into the space that was now also Laura's was more than a logistical gesture, it was a stance on the present, the past, and borders. He'd talked to Laura that afternoon, the sand still clinging to his shins, and he'd been honest about his fear of hurting her. Laura rested her head on his shoulder and whispered that it would hurt more to deny her daughter a simple wish because of a pride they'd already left behind, that trust is proven in the small, everyday scenes, not in grand speeches. On the day of the party, Michael planned the schedule like a map, Emily would arrive early to help Sophie with the flags and leave right after the birthday song, when Laura's family arrived. It wasn't a graceful dismissal, it was an emotional maneuver to ensure no one was put in a painful position. Emily showed up at the appointed time with a bag of colorful ribbons and a restrained smile. Sophie jumped on her neck and began giving pretend orders about where everything should go, and Emily responded with light humor that she obeyed small bosses who were good at what they did. Michael watched them from the kitchen, stirring the frosting, and realized that, for the first time, that kind of coexistence seemed possible. There was a conversation he hadn't expected when Laura arrived a little earlier than planned and found Emily stretching the ribbon on the doorframe. The two exchanged glances for a moment that could have been awkward, but wasn't. Laura said the ribbon would look better if it moved a finger up to the left, and Emily, without apologizing, moved a finger up to the left and smiled. In the backyard, among balloons and confetti, Laura approached and spoke with the simplicity of someone who doesn't argue. We're going to protect these two together, you in the way of a mother, me in the way life brought me to be, and Emily, with a small nod, responded that she understood and that she was grateful to see the children safe and affectionate with everyone there. The birthday party was one of those scenes that stay in your memory because of the details, Sophie squeezing her eyes shut to blow, Noah drumming on the plate, Michael trying to contain his emotion when his daughter whispered that it was the best cake ever, and Emily, a few steps away, far enough away not to intrude, close enough for the girl to meet her gaze. When the doorbell announced Laura's family's first guests, Emily grabbed her bag and signaled she was leaving. Michael walked her to the gate, and she asked for a minute, not to reminisce about the past, but to make a request that landed on him with the weight of adult decisions. If, one day, the children wanted to sleep over at her house on the same weekend they were with their father, he would consider relaxing the routine, not for her sake, but for theirs, because sometimes a child's heart doesn't understand a calendar. Michael took a deep breath, looked out at the backyard where Laura was dancing with Sophie, feigning a clumsy step, looked at Noah explaining the rules of a game to two cousins, and replied that yes, there would be flexibility, as long as the agreements were respected and everything was discussed without ambiguity. Emily pressed her lips together in silent thanks and walked away with light steps, like someone who finally learned to leave before ruining a good moment. The following days brought another kind of crossroads, less visible and more intimate. Michael had been storing old photos, letters, and the wedding album in a wooden box at the back of his closet. The box seemed to carry an energy he no longer wanted in the new home he was creating, but he also couldn't bring himself to throw it away because it also told Noah and Sophie's story. One rainy Saturday, he took the box out of the closet, placed it on the living room table, and stood there, watching, while Laura swept up crumbs from her breakfast. He said, without asking for advice, that perhaps it was time to return some of it to Emily, not as a kindness, but as a symbolic gesture of putting everything back in its place. Laura, who hated and loved that box for the same reason, replied that if he felt the time was right, she would be there while he did it. Michael called Emily and asked her to stop by late that afternoon to pick up a few objects he thought would make more sense with her. Emily arrived discreetly, without strong perfume or excessive makeup, and when she saw the box, she understood without him needing to explain. They opened it together, taking out photos showing Noah's first steps, Sophie's tiny hands, and Emily touched the images with an almost reverent delicacy, saying that sometimes she also needed to remember that, despite the ruin, there had been so much love there. Michael replied that love did exist, but that its existence doesn't redeem choices that disrespected him, and that, at this point, the most honest thing was to acknowledge both sides without trying to stitch them back together. Then came the conversation that swirled around the three adults like a breeze insisting on slipping through the cracks, Michael and Laura's future. It wasn't a proposal or an official announcement, but a concrete move towards something already visible. Michael didn't want to turn the house into a minefield of insecurity for the children or Laura, so he proposed a simple dinner, just the four of them, in the living room, to discuss the changes that would gradually come, more drawers for Laura, a calendar with each of their milestones, shared decisions about school, vacations, and routine. Noah shouted that the important thing was that no one fight over toothbrushes, and Sophie asked if more drawers would fit more storybooks. Laura laughed, Michael felt his chest expand, and he promised there would be room for everything that was real. Emily wasn't there that night, by conscious choice, and later learned via text what had been decided. She replied that she supported the new circle that was forming, that she wanted to be on the side of it without trying to get into the center, and that if at any point she made a mistake in her tone, she would like to be corrected, not out of harshness, but out of care. Not everything went smoothly. One weekend, Noah asked to sleep over at his mother's house outside of the agreed-upon schedule because he wanted to show off a science project he was putting together and didn't want to disassemble it to take home. Michael hesitated, not because of the work, but because he felt he was giving in to an improvisation that could become the norm. He invited Laura to the meeting and then called Emily with Noah by his side, and said he would agree, as long as Noah was back for the soccer tournament the next day at 9 in the morning, without delays or excuses. Emily accepted and complied, and the exact fulfillment of the agreement, repeated several times, began to cement a new, pragmatic trust that doesn't require love to exist, only consistency. It was during this period that a brief, decisive scene occurred. Emily ran into Laura, by chance, as she was leaving the market. The two found themselves in narrow aisles, each with a basket in their hands. Emily started to walk away to avoid the encounter, but turned back, stopped, and said quietly that she knew it was awkward to say thank you, but she needed to say that the way Laura looked at the children, especially when no one was looking, had calmed parts of her that might never completely calm down. Laura, unadorned, replied that the children were their meeting point, and that if they were okay, the two women could exist in the same world without war. They parted the hallway and continued on. As spring began to dawn, a new invitation arrived, this time from school, an outdoor activity where parents would help pitch tents with their children and spend a few hours at a collective picnic. The old fear of confusion nagged at Michael, but Noah and Sophie, with a twinkle in their eye, asked the three adults to go, each with a different role because, according to the teacher, teams that best share the tasks build the sturdiest tents. Michael laughed at the unintentional metaphor and agreed. On the day, he brought the stakes and the manual. Laura was in charge of the snacks, Emily the blankets and lanterns. They set up a tent that Noah named with a mix of everyone's initials, and Sophie hung small decorations at the entrance. When the tarp finally settled, Michael realized that, in practice, they were creating exactly what life required of them, a structure where the children could shelter, held together by different hands, in silence and collaboration. It is in this movement that the moral dilemma takes on definitive shape for Michael, the line between not denying the children their mother's presence and not allowing their mother's presence to disrupt the life he is building with Laura. He constantly finds himself in situations that require quick, sensitive decisions, like accepting an invitation to a school event that Emily will also be attending, or deciding whether the children can take old mementos to their mother's house without it becoming a gateway to melancholic discourse. He adjusts his compass each week, but discovers an internal compass. Those who act out of loyalty to their children's future never make an irreparable mistake. One night, sitting on the porch, he tells Laura that he is afraid of unintentionally hurting her by choosing what is best for the children, and Laura, with the honesty she sustains, responds that we feel pain, but we avoid confusion with clarity, that if he keeps naming what he does and why, nothing can bring them down. Michael realizes that there lies the most important brick of what is being built, trust that doesn't require perfection, just truth. At the end of this stretch of road, when the moon seems larger than usual and the children are asleep after a long day of laughter and chores, Emily writes a short message to Michael saying she's requested a transfer to a school in another neighborhood, not to keep her children away from her, but to see life from a different perspective and avoid passing through the same places every day that remind her of her mistakes. She would like to have lunch with Noah and Sophie to tell them this, ask for ideas on how to organize their schedules, and hear what they have to say. Michael reads, thinks, looks at Laura, who receives the news with a silent yes, and agrees. He acknowledges, without saying it, that Emily is learning the most difficult construction, that of a conscience that chooses renunciation as proof of love for her children, not as pity. He accepts that he will be at this lunch, not as a confidant, not as a close friend, but as a father witnessing the mother of his children finally choose responsibility without an audience. And when lunch arrives, in a simple, bright restaurant with paper napkins and glass cups that clink when touched, Noah asks if the distance will change the way they play on the weekends. Sophie wants to know if there's room to plant flowers at the new school. Emily responds precisely that nothing changes their right to be loved, that the address doesn't determine the size of the hug. Michael, with the calmness he took so long to find, adds that their home will always have the right door and the right schedule, and that life may change the frame, but the painting inside remains. They lead hand in hand, each on their own path, and the story, which seemed to have already found calm, still holds a final tremor, because choices like these, firm and serene, often call for testing fate. Michael's phone vibrates with a short message from the city hall announcing a change in the school calendar and a proposal for a joint activity, something that will require another round of conversations, adjustments, and decisions. He smiles slightly, not because he finds it easy, but because he knows that, from now on, there is a method and, above all, a purpose. And as the afternoon slowly falls, with the light gilding the facades, life prepares for the outcome that demands courage and tenderness at the same time, as if to say, without fanfare, that the true ending is not a point, it is the line we decide to draw when we understand each person's exact place in our story. Winter arrived with a biting wind and shorter days, bringing a different silence to everyone's lives. Emily had moved to the new neighborhood a few months ago, and the physical distance seemed to have also reorganized the emotional distance between her and Michael. The children's visits continued as planned, with schedules respected and communication clear, without interference or ulterior motives. With each meeting, Emily seemed more aware of her place in their lives, more firm in her responsibilities, and less inclined to seek any kind of reconciliation. There was a strange calmness to it, an acceptance that didn't come suddenly, but from the understanding that some things, once broken, can't be restored to their original state, only transformed into something different. Laura had become an undeniable presence in their daily lives. Not only because of her relationship with Michael, but also because of the way she had earned the affection and trust of Noah and Sophie. They already sought her out for advice on simple things, shared small victories of the day, and asked her to come see their performances. Michael observed this with a mixture of gratitude and care, understanding that love and bonds are built with patience, and that her presence had been essential for his children to feel secure amidst so many changes. He knew that, in an ideal world, children could grow up with all the adults around them working in harmony, but he also knew that life isn't made of ideals, but of daily decisions, and his were becoming increasingly firm. The moral dilemma that had plagued him since the separation had found a balance. Michael learned to identify when he needed to be flexible and when he needed to remain rigid, always thinking of what was best for Noah and Sophie. There was no longer any resentment toward Emily, but there was also no longer any room for her to influence his life beyond what concerned the children. This clarity gave him a quiet freedom, and he began to envision the future without the weight of the past. He decided it was time to make his life with Laura official, not in a rush, but with the certainty that she was already part of his story. The proposal happened intimately, without a large crowd. On a quiet night, with the children already asleep, Michael invited Laura to the balcony, where the yellow light and gentle chill created a comfortable setting. He spoke briefly but truthfully, saying that he wanted to build the rest of his life with her, that he wanted the children to grow up with the image of a healthy and stable home, and that there was no one else he would rather share that journey with. Laura, moved, accepted, and in that moment, he felt he was closing the last door that still connected the present to the past. When Noah and Sophie found out, they reacted with genuine joy. They asked if they could help choose some things for the ceremony and if Laura could continue the same bedtime story times. It was a moment of unity that showed Michael that, despite everything they had been through, true love and constant care had prevailed. He decided the ceremony would be small, with only family and close friends, and that Emily would be invited, not out of obligation, but because she was the mother of his children and had a right to see them on an important day for the family. The wedding day was cold but sunny. Emily arrived with the children, elegant but discreet. She greeted Laura with a warm smile and handed Sophie a small bouquet to carry in the procession. There were no long speeches, but during the reception, Emily approached Michael and said she truly hoped he would be happy. There was no sadness in her voice, only the calm weariness of someone who had learned, the hard way, the value of losing something that never returns. Michael thanked her and replied that everyone deserves peace in their hearts, and that he hoped the same for her. Over time, Emily built a new, quieter life, away from the prying eyes of before. She began to dedicate more time to her career and volunteer projects, finding meaning in spending her time on something bigger than herself. She remained present for Noah and Sophie, and her relationship with Laura became respectful and functional. There wasn't a close friendship, but there was cooperation, and that was enough to maintain a healthy environment for the children. She knew she would never get back what she lost, but she understood that she could, at least, not lose anything else she still had. Noah grew up observing everything with watchful eyes, learning that love isn't just about happy moments, but also about firm choices when things get tough. Sophie, with her infectious energy, learned that loyalty is a gift not to be given to just anyone, and that family is made of those willing to care, not just those who share the same blood. Both became the link that somehow kept everyone connected, even if in different roles. Michael, looking back, knew the path had been arduous, but he also knew he had reached a safe place. He understood that the love he and Emily shared existed, but that wrong choices can erode even the strongest foundations. With Laura, he found not only a new love, but a new meaning for what partnership means. They learned to build together without fear of the old ruins, and this was reflected in every simple gesture of their daily lives. Each family's fate was finally settled, Emily, aware that her choices had cost her dearly, but with the dignity of continuing to care for her children. Laura, solidified as an inseparable part of that family, Noah and Sophie growing up with the certainty that they were loved and protected, and Michael, finally at peace, with a home that represented not only the love but also the stability he always wanted to offer those he loved. And this story ends with a lesson that resonates far beyond the characters. Betrayal is not just a momentary act, it is a choice that creates deep rifts that span time and change the course of entire lives. It not only destroys the love between two people but also undermines the trust of everyone around them. Once broken, trust is never the same, and it takes more than words to rebuild something. Sometimes, you have to accept that some losses are permanent. Comment on what you thought of this story, share your opinion, we want to know how it touched you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more intense and emotional stories like this one. And remember, we do not condone any kind of betrayal here. Stories like this are a warning about how thoughtless decisions can destroy homes, families, and feelings that seemed unshakable. May it serve as a reflection to never jeopardize what truly matters.